Hello knitting friends! Welcome back to my channel. I'm Caffeinated Granny. Today we are going to be talking about 50 knitting tips that I wish I knew sooner. Let's go! Tip number one is knowing your knit stitches and your purl stitches inside out. In your work, a knit stitch will look like a sort of V shape like this, and on the needle I like to think that it sort of looks like Betty Boop or like a pin-up girl, you know, with one foot in front of the other. If the knit stitch is like this way, you know, the needle is facing this way, the right leg will be at the front, always. Same with the purl stitch. And a purl stitch sort of looks like a wave. It's also good to remember that when you knit purl stitches, the yarn is at the front. So when you pick up a stitch, you need to remember that the yarn is always at the front. So you pick up the stitches by having the yarn at the front. And then you also need to remember that when you place the stitch back on the needle, the right leg needs to be at the front. If you do the opposite way, if the right leg of the stitch is at the back, you'll end up with a massive hole. So make sure that that right leg of the stitch is at the front, crossing over. And similar to that, if you've lost a knit stitch and you want to save that knit stitch, you need to make sure that the yarn is at the back, just like when you knit a knit stitch. So then you pick up the stitches by putting your needle through the stitch and then taking the yarn from the back and bringing to front. And when you place it on the needle, make sure that that right leg is also at the front. Knowing just sort of the anatomy of a knit stitch and a purl stitch will save you a lot of time down the line. The next trick is for when you are knitting with multiple yarns at the same time. It's very easy to get those mixed up in each other, and then there's knots, and then you're gonna spend so much time like trying to undo those knots, and it's just very annoying. I have this little trick for each yarn skein that I have. I give them its own cereal bowl, and as I'm like tugging on the yarn just like turns over in the cereal bowl. Usually it stays there, depends on how slippery the yarn is. If you have super slippery yarn, you can also use, hold on. So right now this bowl is used for a plant clipping, but as you can see, it's a little bit of a taller plant pot. So I also used to use this a lot for slippery yarn because it's quite deep. It's worth going and getting some of these, and you can even get them in different patterns, and they can be very fun and decorative, and it will save you a lot of hassle with knots. My third tip is for blocking. So often it just makes the stitches open up, so there's more drape, it looks more flowy. I highly recommend you blocking your garments. You'll see it makes a huge difference. With blocking, obviously there are things that you should look out for, like don't leave it in the water too long. The water cannot be too hot. If you handle the yarn too harshly, it might felt, and you don't want that. A tip that I have on blocking to not make it last so long, because a lot of the time in the beginning, I used to block my garments just on the blocking mat, which is like a sponge material, right? So it sucks in the moisture. So what happens is that when I leave the garment on that sponge material, the moisture just like stays there. It just takes ages for it to dry. But if you put something between your garment and the blocking mat that doesn't suck up moisture, it dries so much quicker. So I usually put like a lightly colored plastic bag underneath my garment. So that way, through the plastic bag, I can still see the lines on the blocking mat, so I can like block it as normal and use the lines to measure how I want my knit to block, while also the garment is on a surface that won't just like take all the moisture in, so thereby it dries faster. Another thing to be aware of when you're blocking your knits, you should measure the different parts. There's been a couple of times where like I would just stretch the arm out a lot, because I have like monkey arms in my family. We have really long arms. The more mileage I can get, the better, you know, so I'll stretch it a lot. And then on the other side, I'll stretch it too, but maybe I won't stretch it as much. So in those cases, when you're stretching your garment, it's important that you keep the proportion. So just make sure that you take a tape measure and you measure your arm on that side, then you measure it on the other side to make sure that it's the same length. My next tip is for better, more even knitting tension. To get better tension, you need a lot of practice, and there's not really ways around that. I have found, for me personally, I remember it made a huge difference once I started knitting while I was watching a movie, because then I wasn't always relying on my vision to look at the tension. By doing that, my muscles got used to how it felt to just hold the yarn thread with this finger, the tension that I had there, how it felt to put the needle through, wrap the yarn around and then take it off. It's like a completely different sensory experience, if that makes sense. So maybe that's worth a try. Just practice knitting without looking at it and see if it makes a difference. Another thing that can impact your tension is the needles that you're using in combination with the yarn. If you're knitting with a soft yarn like silk, mohair, that will easily slip off the needles if you're using like plastic or metallic needles. But if you're using needles with a bit more grip, like for instance wood or bamboo, you'll find that the stitches stays on. And then on the contrary, if you're knitting with a very bulky yarn, a very rough yarn, then you don't want to use wooden needles, because then it's quite difficult to get the stitches to slide off and you like manually have to push them off. In that case, it's better to use metal or plastic needles. The next tip is about utilizing the amazing resource Ravelry. I never really used to use Ravelry up until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it's an excellent website for just looking at other people's projects and finding out like yarn substitutes. Maybe you want to knit this sweater by Petite Knit, but that yarn isn't available for you in your country. Then you can go on her profile on Ravelry, check out the projects underneath the sweater that you want to knit, and then you can see what types of yarn people use. You can read their project notes. It's really, really handy. I often find that the color that's depicted on the website doesn't really necessarily depict how that will look like in real life. So for that, I find it super useful to go on Ravelry, look up that yarn and see projects with the yarn and see more, realistic photos or photos that people have taken with their phone without like the amazing line and the backdrop, whatever. And then you get a better sense of what that color is. The next tip you've heard before, it might annoy you, but that is to do a gauge swatch. There's a reason why everyone tells you to do a gauge swatch. It's because you should do it. I've definitely not done it before, and I always wish that I did in the end, because through the gauge swatch you can test, are these needles the right type of needles for the project? Do I really want to use wooden or should I use metal needles here? How does this yarn color look? If I'm using 2 different types of yarn knit together, how is that going to look? You check out your gauge, of course, to see if it's similar to what the pattern is telling you. You can also test out different type of textures in your knit, like cables and eyelets and stuff like that. See how that affects your gauge. And ultimately, it's just the quickest way to see if your garment that you're gonna knit will fit you through the gauge, because there's loads of times that maybe you're using a different yarn than in the pattern and you think it's going to be fine, and then at the end you're like realizing like way into the project, like holy, this is so big, like how did I not see this before? And if you just did a tiny little square gauge swatch at the beginning, that would have saved you so many hours of trouble. So please do a gauge swatch. And I'm also saying this to myself. Just do it. Just take the time to do it. The next tip is to take your time on finishing touches, and this will make a world of difference on your garment. It will be the difference from your garment looking like it's obviously handmade to looking like, oh, that could be bought in the store. I'm talking about finishes like I-cords, double knitted plackets. Huge difference. And if you do things like make your color double and then fold it and sew it down, that will look so good. That looks so professional. People will definitely think that you bought it in the store. If you're working on a project like a knitted bag or a knitted hat, you might want to consider adding stiffener at the end or using a stiffener spray. It's very quick, so I just put a little bit of that on like a piece of cloth and then I just dab it on my knitting project and I leave it for an hour, and then after an hour the fabric has stiffened, which is really nice, so it holds its shape much better. For your finishes as well, go down maybe 2 needle sizes so that it's tighter. They'll make a huge difference. Also, it's very common for your garment to stretch out over time, particularly, you know, as you're taking on and off your head. So doing a little finish like sewing in an elastic thread, just making sure those stitches stay tight and that they don't just sag over time. And also make sure that if you do, for instance, I-cord straps, that stretches a lot over time. It's basically holding the whole weight of the whole garment. So in general, when you're making I-cord straps, just make sure that you stretch them out as you knit them. And then if you know that you want your strap to measure like, let's say 20 centimeters, just make it 18. Another finishing touch that really makes a big difference is when you have like a ribbed hem, let's say on your cuffs. Once you finish the ribbed hem, do like a stretchy bind off, because that makes sure that your rib hem will stay elastic. A lot of the time, if you just bind off regularly, you'll find that it's really hard to get your arm through and it just doesn't look as good. So on your cuffs, if you have a ribbed hem, definitely take the time to do like an Italian bind off or something along those lines. It will just make your garment look way more professional. I know that it's very tempting when you finish your garment to be like, yes, I just want to wear it. I just want to show it to everyone. I just want to block it. Blah, 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 blah. You're so excited to wear it and show it, your beautiful creation, to the world. I get it. Try to have that mindset of, I'm going to make this as good as possible. I'm going to make this into an object that I will wear forever. That's the main goal, to just make it as good as possible, as long lasting as possible, and just make sure that you really take your time, really enjoy adding these finishes to your project, because it feels so good at the end once you've taken the time to do these little tiny extra steps, and it just like elevates your project to a whole new level. Next tip is take project notes. And I'm definitely guilty of not doing this. Write down the needle size you used. Because there's loads of times that you have like multiple whips going on at the same time, and then you're just like, oh, I'm just going to take the needle from here and I'm going to put these stitches on hold, and I'll remember that I used this needle size for that project. Yeah. No. So write it down, everything. Make it foolproof. Write down, I used this yarn. It's also good to keep an eye on how many skeins you used of yarn, how many balls. So the next tip is that it's okay to have multiple projects going at the same time. Something that I see that's very typical for beginner knitters is that they will only have one project that they will be hyper focused on. As you advance more in your knitting journey, you'll find that it's quite handy to have the mindless stockinette project for when you're on the train, public transport, when you're watching a movie, because stockinette is really boring, but usually quite easy to remember from muscle memory. So you can easily, watch a movie while you knit, and at the end of the movie you'll be like, whoa, I went through so much stockinette through the body, yay. But then if you have that same project where you're just doing stockinette and you're sitting at home in your sofa, you're not focusing on anything else, and you're just doing that, it gets really boring. So for when you are over the whole day, maybe you have like a whole day that you have dedicated to knitting, on those days you want to have a project that's more fun, something where you're following a pattern, where you're doing cables, something more challenging. So it's totally okay to have multiple whips going at the same time. The next tips is to avoid armhole holes. So it's quite common when you knit a sweater to have holes underneath your armholes from when you're like picking up stitches. So when I'm picking up stitches for the armhole of a sweater, I'll make sure to pick up 2 extra stitches here for this armhole hole and 2 extra stitches here for this other hole that's gonna... How is this making sense? Anyway, I'm picking up 4 extra stitches. So what I'm doing is that for there's gonna be 2 holes, right? Usually in the armhole, one here and then one here on the other side. So what I like to do is that as I'm approaching the first armhole, so let's say this one, I'll make an SSK. So the increase leans that way, right? And then right after the SSK, I'll knit 2 together, and that increase will lean that way. So instead of having a hole there, I have 2 stitches going like that, and that's really like tightening up the hole, and there's no hole, by the way, if you do. So the next tip is to use a project bag for when you're on the go. There's loads of times that I'm going somewhere, so I'll just put my knitting boom directly into my bag, where I have keys, I have my wallet, I have my phone, I have maybe chewing gum, maybe I have some sand at the bottom of my bag from being at the beach, so when you're knitting, it's just cluttered up in that. It can get damaged from your keys, you get sand into the strands, it's not okay. So in general, when you're taking your knitting with you, get a little project bag to put it in, or just like a plastic bag just to separate it from the other stuff that you have in your bag. The next tip is to use scrap yarn to make knitting accessories. So imagine you just finished a sweater, but you have a little bit of scrap yarn left. What can you do with that scrap yarn? One really nice and quick knit that you can do is to make like a little knitting accessory that will go with that sweater. So for instance, I like to make tiny scrunchies. So the way that I do it, I'll just have an elastic, maybe a store-bought elastic, or I also have like elastic bands that I buy at my yarn shop. So I'll have like a little elastic band, I'll cut it, I'll make a knot, and then I'll make a little square from the scrap yarn that I have and connect that with the elastic inside, and then just sew that up, and bam, you have a little cute elastic scrunchie that goes well with your outfit. The next tip is to choose the right yarn for your pattern. So if you're knitting a pattern that already exists, you'll see like a yarn that they recommend. So maybe you don't have that yarn available to you, or you want to use some yarn in your stash, then what you can do is that you can go on like a yarn substitution website and look up that yarn and see, what's a good substitute for that? Or you can just figure out what type of yarn classification that yarn is in. For instance, if it's a DK weight, then you can find another DK weight yarn and then check if the gauge is the same. My next tip is to sign up to be a test knitter. So hear me out. I know this might be scary if you're a beginner and you feel like, oh, I'm not advanced enough to do stuff like this, but you should, because being a test knitter, you're learning new techniques, you're learning a new pattern, you are getting new knitting friends, you're getting to be a part of this community, and it's a perfect opportunity to ask questions about techniques that you don't necessarily know that much about, because the pattern designer, usually they want their pattern to be easily readable by beginners. So when you're asking these questions, you're not being annoying. If you're asking, oh, wait, can you expand? How am I supposed to do this? don't be afraid to ask them questions, because most likely they are going to be happy to help you. So it's a perfect opportunity to learn a new technique and to ask, like, what you think is a dumb question. Anything goes in a test net. You can ask questions. Alright, so those were all the knitting tips that I had for you today. I hope you found it interesting and I hope you learned something new. If you have a knitting tip of your own that I didn't share here, then feel free to write it down below in the comments. It's always good to learn new things. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I'll see you soon. Beijinhos!